There is something living in the mountains above the White River, something that has been there longer than any government, any border, any language spoken on this continent. I know this because I touched it. I felt its hand on mine. And the woman I loved, the woman who understood what it was better than anyone alive. She took that secret to her grave 9 months ago. Now my lungs are turning to stone. And this is the only chance I have left to tell you what she told me, what I saw, and why the Apache people do not fear this creature. They fear what happens to the world when it is gone. But I need to start at the beginning, because you will not believe the end unless you understand how a Catholic boy from South Boston ended up kneeling in the dirt at 9,000 feet, pulling a steel trap off the leg of something that should not exist. My name is Thomas Callahan. Most people around Fort Apache called me Dr. Tom, or just Doc. I ran the only veterinary practice between Show Low and White River for 41 years. I am 78 years old, and I have idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. That is a medical way of saying my lungs are turning into scar tissue. Every breath I take feels like pulling air through a wet wool blanket. The doctors at the VA hospital in Phoenix gave me 2 years. That was 14 months ago. I am not telling you that for sympathy. I am telling you that because it is the reason I am finally talking. My wife Naelli passed 9 months ago. Ovarian cancer. She went quiet and dignified, same way she did everything. And with her gone, the last person who shared this secret, who carried it alongside me for 36 years, is no longer here to tell me to keep my mouth shut. So let me tell you how it started. Spring of 1983. I was 27, fresh out of veterinary school at Colorado State, drowning in student loans. The Indian Health Service adjacent program had a placement that would forgive a chunk of my debt if I served 4 years in a rural community. I did not know a single thing about the Apache people. I grew up in South Boston, son of a plumber and a school cafeteria worker, both second-generation Irish. The wildest animal I had ever treated was a neighbor's Labrador that ate an entire roll of aluminum foil. When I stepped off the bus in White River, Arizona, I looked at those mountains. The Mogollon Rim stretching northwest, all that ponderosa pine and Douglas fir covering the slopes like a dark green blanket, and I thought I had landed on another planet. The air was different, thin and sharp at 7,000 feet. It smelled like juniper and wood smoke and something older than I had words for. I remember standing there on that dirt road, hearing nothing but wind through the trees and dogs barking somewhere down the valley, and feeling for the first time in my life that the land itself was watching me. I did not know then that the land actually was. The clinic was modest, cinder block building, 2 exam rooms, a small surgical suite the previous vet had set up before he left after 18 months. The instruments were dated. The autoclave barely worked. The X-ray machine was older than I was, but it was mine. And I threw myself into it the way you throw yourself into anything when you are 27 and terrified and trying to prove that you made the right decision. Now, here is the thing about working as a veterinarian on the reservation. It changed me before anything else did. My patients were mostly horses, cattle, and working dogs. A horse on the Apache Reservation was not a pet. A horse was transportation, livelihood, identity. When a family brought in a sick horse, there was a weight to it. I learned to recognize fast. You could see it in their faces, the way they stood, the way they touched the animal's neck and spoke to it in low voices. Losing that horse was not an inconvenience. It was a fracture in the family's ability to function. I drove my old Ford pickup on roads that were more suggestion than pavement, out to remote homesteads and cattle camps, where families lived miles from anyone. Some drives were 2 hours each way through country so empty that if your truck broke down, you were walking until someone happened along, and that might be a day or more. I learned to stitch up barbed wire wounds by flashlight, kneeling in corrals that smelled like dust and manure and sage. I learned to pull calves in the mud at 3 a.m. while the mother bawled and the rancher held a lantern, and the coyotes sang on the ridgeline like they were narrating the whole scene. And I learned something else. Something no veterinary school teaches you. I learned that when an Apache elder brought you a horse, you did not just treat the horse, you listened. You drank the coffee they offered, even if it was thick enough to stand a spoon in. You sat on the porch and you let the silence be comfortable, because in that culture silence was not empty. Silence was respect. An old man named Clarence Docella told me once that the reservation was a testing ground for white people. Most of you come here thinking you'll help us, he said. Then you find out how hard the work is and how far apart everything is and how lonely it gets, and you leave. The ones who stay are the ones who figured out they needed this place more than it needed them. He was right about me. But there was another reason I stayed. Naelli walked into my clinic on a Tuesday in October of 1983. She had a red heeler with a foxtail embedded deep in its left ear canal. She was 25, tall for a woman, maybe 5'9". Black hair past her shoulders, hands rough from work. She was a wildland firefighter with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, one of the few women on the Fort Apache hotshot crew at the time. She carried herself like someone who had walked through actual fire and come out the other side unimpressed. She did not make small talk. She watched everything I did with the dog, asked precise questions about the anesthesia, watched the way I held the otoscope, watched the way I positioned the dog's head. She was not anxious the way most pet owners are during procedures. She was evaluating, deciding whether I was competent, whether I was worth trusting with something she cared about. And when I told her the foxtail was out and the dog would be fine, she nodded once and said thank you without smiling. She paid in cash, exact change, and she was halfway out the door before I realized I did not even know her name. I found out later from one of my regulars. Naelli, hotshot crew, lived alone in a small house near the old sawmill site. Her parents had passed when she was young, and she had been raised by her maternal grandmother, a woman named Dolores who was known throughout the reservation as someone who understood the old ways, the kind of woman people went to when Western medicine could not explain what was wrong. It took me 4 months to ask Naelli to dinner. When I did, she looked at me for a long moment and said, "You're going to leave in 2 years like the others." I told her I was not. She said, "We'll see." We were married by the following autumn, and she spent the next 40 years proving that she was right about most things, and I was right about one: I was never going to leave. Now, Naelli was the one who first told me about the things in the mountains, but she did not use the word Bigfoot. She did not use any English word at all, not at first. She told me about the gone, the mountain spirits, and she told me about something else. Would say things like, the old people would say things like, the old people know what lives up in the high timber. They have always known. And when I pressed her, she would go quiet, change the subject, close the door on the conversation as gently as you close a door on a sleeping child. But there was one thing she said early on that I never forgot, one sentence that planted itself in my chest like a seed and grew roots through every year that followed. She said, "My people do not fear them. They fear what happens to the world when the old walkers are gone." I did not understand that sentence in 1984. I understand it now. What happened next is the reason I cannot sleep at night, the reason my hands shake when I tell this story, and the reason a dying man is breaking 36 years of silence. Summer of 1987. A rancher named Dalton Kosei called me out to his cattle camp, up near Holly Lake, 9,000 feet elevation, deep in the Apache National Forest. 3 of his cows had come back with injuries he could not explain. I drove up there expecting the usual, barbed wire lacerations, maybe a cougar encounter. Dalton was a careful rancher, 3rd generation, and his cattle were well managed. But things happen in the high country. Animals get into trouble in ways that do not always make sense from the road. What I found did not make sense from anywhere. Deep lacerations along their flanks, but not from barbed wire, not from any predator pattern I recognized. Cougars leave puncture wounds and claw marks in parallel. Bears leave ragged, torn tissue. Wolves, and there were no wolves in Arizona at that time, leave bite marks concentrated around the hindquarters and throat. These cuts were clean, deliberate, almost surgical, spaced evenly along the rib cage. 3 parallel lines on each animal, as if something with enormous hands had raked its fingers along their sides with controlled force, enough to cut through hide and into muscle, but not deep enough to hit organs or bone. Whatever made these marks was not desperate or violent. It was careful. I knelt beside the first cow, ran my hand along the wounds, and felt a cold confusion settle into my chest. In all my years of training and practice, I had never seen marks like that on a living animal. Dalton stood behind me, arms crossed, said something in Apache I did not catch. When I asked what he said, he shook his head. "Nothing, Doc, just fix them up." I sutured the wounds, gave the animals antibiotics, but something about those lacerations stayed with me. They were too precise, too intentional. On the drive back down the mountain, the headlights cutting through dark timber as the sun went down, I stopped once to check a map. Killed the engine. The silence hit me like a wall. Not the pleasant silence of a quiet evening. A silence that felt manufactured. No crickets, no owls, no wind in the canopy. Just a dense, ringing nothing that made the hair on my arms stand up. I stood beside my truck for maybe 30 seconds, staring into the tree line, and I had the strongest sensation I have ever felt, that something was staring back. Not a bear, not a cougar, something standing upright between 2 ponderosa pines about 80 yards away. Something so still I could not actually see it, but I could feel its mass displacing the air, the way you feel a large vehicle passing on the highway, even with your eyes closed. My lungs were fine back then, but I could not breathe. I got back in the truck and drove home at 60 miles an hour on a road rated for 20. I did not tell Naelli that night, but she knew. She watched me at the kitchen table for a long time while I pretended to read a veterinary journal. Then she said, "You went up to Holly Lake." "Yes, and something followed you to the road." 3 weeks later, she drove me to a ridgeline above the east fork of the White River, parked the truck facing east, sat there without speaking for a long time. Then she told me what her grandmother had told her. The mountains have a heartbeat, and the ones who keep the heartbeat going are the ones no white person is supposed to see. The old walkers are not animals. They are not monsters. They are the ones who remember what the world was before humans forgot how to listen. I asked her if she meant Bigfoot. She did not flinch at the word, but she did not use it either. After that conversation, I started keeping a log. Dates, locations, animal behavior, weather conditions, clinical notation, objective observations, no interpretation. I was a veterinarian with a degree from Colorado State. I understood animal behavior, endocrine responses, flight instincts, herd dynamics. There had to be a rational explanation. I ran through every possibility. New predator in the territory, mining runoff changing water chemistry, seismic activity too subtle for humans, but within animal perception range. I eliminated them one by one, the way you work through a differential diagnosis, crossing off causes until you are left with the one you do not want to write down. By winter of '88, I had 47 entries, 11 locations across the reservation and surrounding forest, every single one above 8,000 feet, within 2 miles of a permanent water source, during the new moon or the 3 days surrounding it. The pattern was territorial, elevation dependent, water proximate, lunar correlated. Those are not the characteristics of a natural predator. Those are the characteristics of an intelligence. And then I saw one, March 12th, 1989. I know the exact date because I wrote it in the margin of a veterinary supply catalog on my dashboard. I had been called to a homestead on the northern edge of the reservation to help with a mare having trouble foaling. The birth went badly. Foal was breech. By the time I got it turned and delivered, the mare had lost too much blood. She died around 2 in the morning with the foal still wet and shaking beside her. The family took the foal inside to warm it. I walked out to my truck to clean up. That is when I saw it. Standing at the edge of the corral fence, 40 feet from me, in the light of a half moon. My hands were still wet. The smell of blood and amniotic fluid hung in the cold air. A dog was barking somewhere down the valley, and there, at the boundary between the human world and something else entirely, it stood. It was enormous. I am 6'1". I have stood beside draft horses my entire career. Animals that weigh 2,000 pounds and stand 17 hands at the shoulder. I have restrained Brahma bulls in squeeze chutes. I have worked on Belgian drafts with hooves the size of dinner plates. I know what large looks like. I know what large feels like when it is standing close to you. This creature made those horses look modest, at least 8 feet tall, possibly closer to 9. Covered in hair that was dark brown, almost black, but caught the moonlight with a reddish undertone, like the way a bay horse's coat shifts color in the sun. Shoulders impossibly broad, twice the width of the largest man I have ever seen. Arms that hung past its knees, thick with muscle that moved beneath the hair, the way muscle moves on a horse's flank. Visible, powerful, alive. And the face. I need to tell you about the face, because that is the part that changed everything. It did not look like an ape. It did not look like anything in any primatology textbook I had ever opened. Its brow was heavy, yes. Its jaw was wide, but its eyes were set forward and close together, like a human's. They caught the moonlight and held it. And in that light, standing 40 feet away with my hands covered in the blood of a dead mare, I saw something in those eyes that I had spent my entire career learning to read. Depth, intelligence, sadness, recognition, something I had seen 1,000 times in animals who were suffering but could not tell me where it hurt. Except this was different. This was not an animal struggling to communicate. This was a being that understood exactly what had just happened inside that house. A birth, a death, a foal left motherless, and had come to witness it. I stood completely still, hands covered in blood from the delivery, air smelling like copper and pine. The creature looked at me. I looked at it. Then it did something I have never been able to explain. It looked past me, toward the house where the orphan foal was, and it made a sound, not a roar, not a howl, a low, resonant hum that I felt in my sternum more than I heard with my ears. It vibrated through the ground, up through my boots, into my spine. I have delivered thousands of animals. I have been present for births and deaths in equal measure, and that sound was a mourning sound. I knew it in my bones. It was grieving for the mare. I do not know how long we stood there. Eventually it turned and walked into the tree line, with a silence that should have been impossible for something that size. It did not crash through brush. It did not snap branches. It moved between trees like water flowing around stones. And then the night sounds came back all at once. Crickets, a distant coyote, wind. as if someone had pressed play on a recording that had been paused. I drove home at dawn. Naelli was at the kitchen table with coffee. She looked at my face and she knew. She said, "Now you understand why my people do not talk about this." She reached across the table and held my shaking hands. Her hands were warm and calloused and steady. She said, "This is not your burden to carry alone. This is our burden, together." That was the beginning. Over the next 3 decades, I saw them 17 more times. I want to be precise about that number. Precision matters. I am a scientist by training, even if I am a storyteller by circumstance. I kept records, the same clinical notation I used in my veterinary charts. Date, time, location, weather, moon phase, duration of encounter, distance, number of individuals, behavior observed. I kept these records in a notebook that I stored in a locked cabinet in my clinic behind the controlled substances where no one would think to look. 17 confirmed visual sightings between 1989 and 2022. Dozens more instances of tracks, footprints in soft soil that measured 16 to 19 inches long, with a stride length that put the creature's height at somewhere between 7 and 9 feet, using standard forensic calculations. Vocalizations at distance, tree structures, saplings woven together in patterns too deliberate to be wind damage, too architectural to be natural, and the silence, that heavy, manufactured quiet that precedes their presence the way a drop in barometric pressure precedes a storm. Naelli was with me for 9 of those 17 sightings. She saw what I saw. She heard what I heard. And unlike me, she was not afraid. She treated their presence the way her grandmother had taught her. Quiet acknowledgement, stillness of body and mind, an understanding that we were visitors in their home, not the other way around. She had a relationship with these creatures that I could never fully access. She would sit on the ground with her back against a tree and close her eyes and hum that low, tuneless melody, and the forest would change. The silence would come first. Then the sounds would return slowly, cautiously, and mixed in among the birdsong and the wind, there would be answering hums from the timber. Naelli would smile with her eyes closed and say, "They're here." She said the old walkers had been part of her people's world since before memory. They were not separate from the natural order. They were the natural order. They were the keepers of something she called the balance, a word she used the way a doctor uses homeostasis, a system of interconnection so complex and ancient that disrupting one thread would unravel the whole fabric. And the old walkers were the thread that held the center together. But the encounter that broke me open, that hollowed me out and rebuilt me as a different man, came in '94, 5 years after that first sighting, and what I found in the high country that autumn is something I still see every time I close my eyes. Autumn of 1994, a group of elk hunters from Tucson found something near Baldy Peak above 9,000 feet, sacred ground. They called the tribal game warden. The game warden called me because he did not know what else to do. What they found was a juvenile. I use that word deliberately, not a baby, a juvenile, the way we use it in veterinary medicine, past infancy but not yet adult. It was lying in a shallow depression between 2 fallen ponderosa logs, partially covered with branches and pine needles, and it was hurt. Its left leg was caught in a steel jaw trap, the kind that had been illegal on reservation land for over a decade. The trap had bitten deep into the tissue just above the ankle. The wound was at least 2 days old based on the swelling and the smell of early infection. The creature was maybe 5 feet tall. Its hair was lighter than the adult I had seen, cinnamon brown, matted with dirt and dried blood around the injury, and it was making sounds I will never forget, small, keening vocalizations that rose and fell in pitch, almost like a child crying, but deeper, more resonant, with a vibration I could feel in my teeth. The elk hunters were standing 20 yards away, two with rifles raised, one on a satellite phone. They were terrified. The game warden, Russell Casey, a man I had known for years, was standing between the hunters and the creature, hands out, telling everyone to calm down. He looked at me with the expression of someone out of their depth and knowing it. "Doc, I don't know what this is, but it's alive and it's hurt, and those idiots want to shoot it." I walked toward the creature slowly, low center of gravity, no direct eye contact, no sudden movements, hands visible, the same principles I use for every injured animal. Wounded cougars, cornered bulls, horses with compound fractures. You make yourself small, you make yourself calm, you let the animal decide. The juvenile looked at me when I was about 10 feet away. I stopped. Its eyes were amber, shot through with flecks of gold, and they were wet with tears. I am not anthropomorphizing. I have spent my entire career studying animal eyes. I know the difference between a mammal's pain response and emotional weeping. This creature was crying. Its chest heaved with each vocalization, and its hands, God, its hands, were gripping the steel jaws of the trap, trying to pry them apart. Its fingers were bleeding from the effort. The hands were enormous, but proportionally similar to a human child's, with thick, dark fingernails like horn and opposable thumbs that gripped the metal with a dexterity no ape possesses. I knelt down, opened my veterinary bag, spoke to it the way I speak to every frightened animal I have ever treated, low, steady, continuous. "I know it hurts. I'm going to help you. You're going to be okay. Just stay still for me." The creature went quiet, stopped pulling at the trap, watched my hands as I pulled out the trap spreader tool. Its eyes tracked the tool, then tracked my face, then the tool again. It understood. I placed the spreader on the jaws, applied pressure. The trap opened with a metallic screech. The juvenile pulled its leg free with a sharp cry and curled into a fetal position, cradling the injured limb. The wound was severe. Exposed tendon, the white glint of bone through swollen tissue. Without treatment, infection would take the leg or the life within days. I cleaned the wound. Saline flush, betadine. A pressure bandage I had to improvise because nothing in my kit was designed for a limb that circumference. The creature flinched when I touched the wound, but did not pull away. It watched me the entire time. And then something happened that I have carried with me for 30 years. While I was wrapping the bandage, its hand came up and rested on top of mine. Not grabbing, not pushing away, just resting there. A contact. A thank you in a language that needed no words. The elk hunters left. Russell Casey and I stayed until dark. At one point he said, "What do we do, Doc?" I said, "We keep our mouths shut." I could see the conflict on his face, the game warden's instinct to report, to document, to follow protocol. But Russell grew up on this reservation. His grandmother was a medicine woman. He understood what Naelli had taught me, that some things are protected by silence, not by science. I went back the next day, and the next, and the next. I brought antibiotics compounded for large animal use, the same cephalosporins I used for infected horse wounds, adjusted for a body weight I estimated at around 220 pounds. I brought clean bandages. I brought food, apples, sweet potatoes, dried elk jerky. I brought a thermal blanket because the nights were dropping into the 20s and the creature had no shelter beyond those fallen logs. Each day I followed the same protocol. Approach slowly. Speak in a low, continuous voice. No sudden movements. Let the patient set the terms. The first day, it watched me from across the depression, pressed against the far log, eyes wide and wary. It let me approach, but flinched at every touch. By the second day, it was calmer. It watched my hands with that same tracking intelligence. Tool, face, and when I changed the bandage, It held its legs still for me, like it had learned the routine, like it understood I was helping. By the third day, it would let me change the bandage without flinching. It made small sounds while I worked, not the keening cries of the first day, but softer vocalizations that rose and fell, almost like someone humming through a conversation. I started talking to it the way I talk to any long-term patient in recovery, telling it about my day, about the weather, about the mare I had lost the week before and the foal that was doing well at the family's homestead. The creature watched my face while I talked, and I cannot prove this, but I believe it was listening to the rhythm and tone of my voice, the way you listen to a song in a language you do not speak. You do not understand the words, but you understand the feeling. By the fourth day, it reached for an apple from my hand, instead of waiting for me to set it on the ground. Its fingers closed around the apple and around my fingers at the same time, just for a moment, and the contact was warm and startlingly gentle for a hand that size. On the fifth day, it was gone. The depression where it had been lying was empty, but the old bandages were neatly placed in a pile, not scattered, placed, and beside the pile was a stack of stones, 4 of them, arranged in a vertical column, largest on the bottom. I stared at those stones for a long time. I have seen animals do remarkable things, horses opening gate latches, dogs finding their way home across hundreds of miles. But I have never seen an animal stack stones with intentional balance and leave them as what could only be interpreted as a message. I told Naelli everything that night. She listened without interrupting. Then she said something I have turned over in my mind every day since. My grandmother told me that the old walkers stack stones when they are making a promise. 4 stones means they will return. I asked her what they were promising. She looked at me with those dark, steady eyes and said, "They are promising that they will remember what you did." They kept that promise. Over the following years, stacked stones appeared at locations where I was working: cattle camps, remote homesteads, trailheads. Once at the edge of the clinic parking lot in White River, which meant they had come down out of the high timber and walked through miles of populated valley just to leave that marker where I would find it. Always 4 stones, always placed with a precision that spoke of deliberate intent. The flat surfaces chosen and oriented so carefully, the columns would not topple in the wind. I began to think of them as letters, correspondence from a neighbor who did not speak your language, but wanted you to know they were thinking of you. And often, if I waited quietly beside one of these stacks, I would catch a glimpse of a figure in the tree line. Sometimes it was the juvenile, growing fast, over 6 feet by 96, approaching 8 feet by 98, the scar on its left leg visible even at 50 yards as a lighter stripe in dark fur. Sometimes there were others, adults. Once I counted 3 standing together on a ridge above Horseshoe Lake at dawn, their silhouettes enormous against the orange sky, perfectly still, watching me the way sentries watch a border. I never felt threatened. I felt observed, assessed, and ultimately accepted. But nothing in 36 years of encounters prepared me for what happened in 2008. That night in the clearing by the Black River, the night they came to us, all of them, and what they did changed my understanding of what these creatures are. I am still not sure the world is ready to hear it. September 2008. Naelli and I camped at a spot we had used for years, a small clearing beside a spring-fed creek in a remote drainage above the Black River, 8,500 feet. The aspens were beginning to turn, scattered patches of gold among dark conifers. We hiked in 3 miles, much harder for me than it used to be with my lungs already showing early signs of the fibrosis. No fire, no lantern, just a ground tarp, sleeping bags, and the contents of our packs. Naelli wanted to show me something, Around 9 that evening, with a sky so full of stars it looked like someone had spilled salt across black velvet, she began her humming. Low, steady, rhythmic, a tuneless melody her grandmother used to sing on the mountain. Within minutes the silence came, that deep electric quiet. Then the answering hums started, from the east, then the north, then directly above us on the slope. They were all around us. Then they emerged from the trees. I need to stop here for a moment. My hands are shaking. My chest is tight. I need to use my inhaler. I have never spoken about this night to anyone other than Naelli. They came into the clearing in pairs. 2 at first, then 2 more. Then a single large individual I recognized immediately. The juvenile, my patient, fully grown now, at least 8.5 feet tall. Same amber eyes shot through with gold, and on its left leg, just above the ankle, a scar, the fur growing in a different direction, lighter in color, a permanent reminder of steel jaws and human cruelty, and one veterinarian with a trap spreader who did the only thing he knew how to do. It looked at me when it entered the clearing, stopped, placed its right hand flat against its chest, and held it there. Naelli leaned into me and whispered, "It is showing you its heart." 7 of them in total, 2 females, slightly narrower builds, lighter facial features, still massive. 3 adult males, including the one I had treated, and 2 juveniles, smaller, maybe 5.5 feet tall, staying close to the females, peering at us from behind their mothers, with a curiosity that was so human it made my throat close. One of the juveniles kept leaning forward and pulling back, the way a shy child does when meeting a stranger. One of the females placed a hand on its shoulder and gently pulled it back. A mother's gesture, universal, unmistakable. They arranged themselves in a loose semicircle at the clearing's edge, about 30 feet away, and they sat down, not crouched, sat cross-legged, the way a human sits around a campfire. Then the large male began to vocalize, not the hum I had heard before, something more complex, a series of tonal sounds rising and falling with pauses between phrases. The other adults responded in kind, overlapping and building on each other's sounds until the clearing was filled with something I can only describe as song. It was not music the way we understand it, no melody, no rhythm I could identify. But there was structure, call and response, something that functioned like language, units that repeated and varied and combined in ways that seemed intentional and meaningful. I sat there with tears running down my face. Naelli held my hand, and we listened to these creatures communicate in a system of sound that predates every human language on Earth. I am a veterinarian. I have studied animal communication my entire career. I know what birdsong sounds like. I know what whale song sounds like. I know how wolves coordinate through howls, how elephants communicate through infrasound, how prairie dogs have been proven to have referential calls that describe specific threats in detail. None of those systems are what I heard that night. What those creatures were doing was structured in a way that implied grammar, syntax, meaning that was being constructed in real time, not merely signaled. One of the adults would produce a sequence of tones, and the others would respond not by repeating it, but by modifying it, adding to it, questioning it, answering it. It was conversation. It was discourse. And the 2 juveniles listened without vocalizing, the way children listen to adults talk, absorbing the patterns before they are ready to produce them themselves. I thought about every paper I had ever read about primate cognition, about Coco the gorilla and her sign language, about Kanzi the bonobo and his lexicograms. Those were animals taught to use human systems of communication. What I was hearing was the opposite, an indigenous communication system that humans had never been taught and never would be. Naelli squeezed my hand so hard it hurt. When I looked at her, her face was wet and shining in the starlight, and she was smiling, she whispered. My grandmother heard this once. She said it was the world remembering itself. They stayed almost an hour. When they left, they dissolved into the trees silently, the way they always do. The last to leave was the large male with the scar. It stood at the tree line and looked back, made a single low, sustained note that I felt in my ribs. In the clearing where they had been sitting, we found 7 stones stacked in a perfect vertical column. Naelli picked up the top stone and held it against her heart, the same gesture the creature had made. She said, "They came to show us something." I asked what. That they are still here, that the balance is still holding, and that they know we have kept the secret. The balance, that word she used the way a doctor uses homeostasis, a system of interconnection so complex and ancient that disrupting one thread unravels the whole fabric. I asked her once, sitting on that same ridgeline above the East Fork, where she first told me about her grandmother, what she meant. What happens when the old walkers are gone? The sun was going down. That particular shade of orange and purple you only get at high elevation in the southwest. Ponderosa bark glowing like copper in the last light. She said, everything in the world is connected by threads you cannot see. The river talks to the trees talk to the elk talk to the mountain lions, and the old walkers talk to all of them. They are the ones who listen to everything. They remember what the land used to be. They carry the memory of the world before humans started forgetting. She paused. When the last one is gone, when the last old walker dies alone in the high country, with no one to remember what it knew, that memory dies with it, and the world does not collapse all at once. It just starts to forget itself. The rivers forget where to go. The animals forget how to find their way. The seasons forget their timing. It happens slowly, so slowly that humans do not notice until it is too late. Tears on her face, catching the last light. That is what my people fear, not the creature, the absence. I carry those words like a stone in my chest, and now I am watching it happen. The East Fork of the White River, which ran strong and cold when I arrived in '83, now slows to a trickle by August. The springs Naelli and I camped beside, springs the elders said had never gone dry in living memory, are failing one by one, like candles being blown out along a dark hallway. The elk herds are climbing past the timberline into terrain where they were never meant to live. Mule deer are thinning. Black bears are coming into town not because they are aggressive, but because the berry crops are failing and the acorn yields have dropped by half in a decade. The animals are stressed in ways I have never seen in 4 decades of veterinary medicine. The fire seasons are longer, hotter, more destructive, burning through forests that took centuries to grow. The old-timers say the land feels different now, lighter, emptier, like something fundamental has been subtracted from the equation and the math no longer works out. And the old walkers are retreating. My last confirmed sighting was 2022, higher elevation than I had ever encountered them, over 10,000 feet, near the summit of Mount Baldy. Terrain so rugged I nearly did not make it on my failing lungs. Naelli had stayed behind that day. Her knees were bothering her. She told me to go, said the mountain was calling and I should answer while I still could. She packed me a lunch and kissed me at the door and told me to be careful, the way she always did, even though we both knew that careful was not really the point anymore. The point was to keep going until you could not. It took me most of the day to reach the ridge. I stopped more times than I could count, sat on rocks, leaned against trees, let the oxygen tank do the work my lungs no longer could. The forest was different up there, thinner, drier. The ponderosas gave way to Engelmann spruce and corkbark fir, and the air had a burnt smell to it, even though the nearest active fire was 40 miles south. A single large male, standing on a ridge, silhouetted against a sky orange with wildfire smoke. It was not the one I had treated. This was older, larger. Its shoulders were heavy with age, and it stood with a stillness that was different from the alert watchfulness I had seen in younger individuals. This was the stillness of something that was not watching for danger. It was watching something end, looking west toward the valleys below. It did not turn when I approached. I do not think it was ignoring me. I think it simply had something more important to look at. I stood there for 5 minutes, breathing hard, portable oxygen hissing in my nostrils, watching this ancient being look out over a burning world. And for the first time in all my years of encounters, I felt something coming from the creature that I had never felt before. Not curiosity, not recognition, not even grief, exhaustion, the kind of weariness that comes not from physical labor but from carrying something too long, the kind I see in my own face every morning in the mirror. And I thought about what Naelli said. They fear what happens to the world when the old walkers are gone. And I realized maybe the old walkers fear it too. Naelli got sick in the spring of 24. The cancer was aggressive. By the time they found it, it had already spread. She handled it the way she handled everything. Directness, practicality, no self-pity. She organized her files, wrote letters to her nieces and nephews, called old friends from the hotshot crew she had not spoken to in years. She sat on the porch every evening and watched the sun go down over the mountains with a cup of tea that she held with both hands, even when the evenings were warm, as if she was absorbing every last degree of heat the world had to offer. She never complained, not once. But I am a man who has spent his life reading pain in the eyes of creatures who cannot speak, and I could see it in hers. Not just the physical pain, the grief of leaving, the grief of knowing that the mountains she loved, the forests she had walked since childhood, the high places where the old walkers roamed, she would never see them again. She made me promise 2 things. First, that I would continue leaving food at the old clearing by the creek, even though I could barely make the hike anymore. Second, that I would know when it was time to tell the story. She said, "You will feel it the way you feel the silence before they come. You will know." I held her hand through the last weeks, fed her soup she could barely swallow, read to her from a book of Apache creation stories that her grandmother had dictated to a university researcher in the 1960s, adjusted her pillows, counted her breaths the way I used to count the breaths of animals coming out of anesthesia, rhythmic, automatic, dreading the pause that would not end. She died on a Wednesday evening in June. Windows open. Pine smell drifting in from the mountains, thunder building over the Mogollon Rim. I held her hand the way she had held mine in that clearing 8 years before, felt the last warmth leave her fingers, and I understood for the first time the true weight of the word absence. I went to the clearing one more time after that. It took 4 hours to hike what used to take 90 minutes, stopping every 50 yards to catch my breath. Leaning on a walking stick, Russell Casey carved from juniper, the oxygen tank on my back felt heavier with every step, and the tubing kept catching on branches, and twice I had to sit down on a rock and just breathe, just focus on the simple act of pulling air into lungs that no longer wanted to accept it. The trail looked different without Naelli walking ahead of me. She always walked ahead, not because she was faster, though she was, but because she liked to be the first one to see the clearing. She would stop at the edge and stand there for a moment, reading the space the way I read an animal's vitals, checking for signs that we were welcome, that the balance was holding. The creek was barely a trickle. The clearing looked smaller than I remembered. The aspens at the edge had lost branches to a windstorm, and one of the old ponderosas where Naelli used to lean while she hummed had a long scar of peeled bark from a lightning strike. I sat down and tried to hum the way she used to, that low, tuneless melody, but my lungs would not cooperate. The sound came out thin and broken, like a radio signal fading out of range. I sat there for 3 hours, waiting. The silence never came. That heavy manufactured quiet that always preceded their arrival. That told you the world was holding its breath. It did not come. I heard birds, the creek, the wind, normal sounds, beautiful sounds, but not the silence. Before I left, I stacked 4 stones by the creek, largest on the bottom, placed my hand on the top stone the way the creature had placed its hand on its chest, and I said out loud, in a voice that came out as barely a whisper because my lungs had nothing left to give, I kept the secret. She kept the secret, and I am sorry that I cannot keep coming here. But I will send this story out into the world, and maybe someone who hears it will understand what Naelli understood, that you are not something to be feared, you are something to be protected, and the world that is forgetting you is a world that is forgetting itself. I sat there for a long time, and just before I started the slow, painful walk back to my truck, I heard something, faint, distant, coming from somewhere up the slope. So far away I could not be sure I was not imagining it. A low, sustained hum, one single note, held for maybe 10 seconds, resonating through the trees and the thin mountain air and the spaces between my damaged breaths, a sound I had heard before, on a moonlit night beside a dead mare and her orphan foal. A mourning sound, a recognition, a goodbye. Naelli told me once that in her language, the word for the old walkers is not a noun. It is a verb. It means something closer to the ones who walk the world into being. Every step they take reminds the earth of what it is supposed to be. Every hum they make holds the threads together, and when the last one is gone, the walking stops, and the world begins the long, slow process of forgetting what it was. I believe her, because I saw them, because I heard them, because one of them put its hand on mine while I treated its wound, and I felt a connection that no amount of science or skepticism has been able to sever. I believe her because the rivers are running low and the fires are burning longer and the animals are retreating to higher ground, and something in the fabric of the world is coming undone, thread by invisible thread. My name is Thomas Callahan. I was a veterinarian for 41 years. I married an Apache woman who taught me how to listen to mountains. And I am telling you this now, with what little breath I have left, because Naelli was right. Some truths are not meant to be buried. They are meant to be released. And this is the only way I know to set this one free.